Professor Stuart Hameroff received his bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh and his MD degree from the Heinemann University Hospital. He's had a very distinguished career at the University of Arizona since 1975, becoming professor in the Department of Anesthesiology and Psychology and associate director for the Center for Consciousness Studies.
Thank you for organizing and inviting us back. It's a great pleasure to be here. So this is a very diverse conference with a lot of different aspects of consciousness and a diverse audience, so I'm going to try to address those. So in the talk, being, you see here, is meant to imply consciousness, awareness, subjective experience, phenomenal first-person point of view, consciousness. We all know what it is. It's just hard to explain or to define or to come to a scientific explanation for. But for the purpose of the talk, being means conscious awareness. And the question is, how does being occur? Why does it occur? So the first question is, what is consciousness? So I'm going to give a sort of definition, mostly from a Western perspective, but I hope to bring together Eastern and Western approaches. Consciousness implies awareness, subjective phenomenal experience of internal and external worlds. Consciousness may also imply a sense of self, feelings, choice, control of voluntary behavior, memory, thought, language, and, when we close our eyes or meditate, internally generated images and geometric patterns. Our views of reality, of the universe, of ourselves depend on consciousness. Consciousness defines our existence. But what consciousness actually is remains scientifically unknown. In Eastern philosophy, consciousness pervades a deeper level of reality. Being consciousness is everywhere. We are a part of it, sort of like a wave in an ocean. What is the origin of consciousness? I think there are three possibilities. Number one, consciousness emerged during biological evolution from complex computation. This is the view taken by most Western scientists, reductionists, materialists, most Western philosophers, most neuroscientists, psychologists, cognitive scientists. The second possibility, which is an Eastern point of view, is that consciousness has always been in the universe as the ground of being, or God in spiritual terms. Consciousness is everything. The third possibility is that consciousness, or its precursor at least, has always been in the universe with cognitive consciousness, with which we are familiar, emerging during biological evolution. And this is more or less the approach taken in the Orch-OR theory that I developed with Sir Roger, that I'll be talking about. So along those lines, when did consciousness arise? So here we have the universe, if you will, with the Big Bang, and the Earth, here's the time scale here, about 14.5 billion years ago. The Earth began about 4.5 billion years ago. Life, simple life, eukaryote animals, the Cambrian explosion with tremendous growth, development of animal species, and very recently on this big scale, language and tools. So at what point in this time scale did consciousness appear on the scene? Well, that depends. Most reductionists, Western scientists, would say fairly recently, in humans or primates perhaps, or simpler animals, but fairly recently, being would be here. Others would say all animal life, all animals have consciousness, eukaryotes, for example. Others would say that even simple organisms have consciousness, maybe even all matter, panpsychists. And some would say that consciousness preceded even the Big Bang, maybe even caused the Big Bang. That, again, is more of an Eastern approach. Now, if we look at evolution, I'm not sure if you can see this slide very well, but the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And if you look at the growth of life, we have blue-green algae and nucleated cells. And here is the first eukaryotic cell, which may have been a symbiotic event from flagellated spirochetes invading prokaryotes. That's the theory of Margulis Sagan. It's a little bit controversial, but this is one possibility. And this brought the cytoskeleton into prokaryotes and gave simple cells the ability to move around, to compartmentalize, become more efficient, and I think process information. And then evolution proceeded rather gradually, very, very small incremental steps, until about 500 million years ago, 550 million years ago, the Cambrian evolutionary explosion, when all the animal phyla developed fairly rapidly. And we know from fossils that these types of organisms were present at that time. Simple worms and strange creatures and urchins. And this particular organism, this urchin, is present today. It's called Actinospherium, and it's spherical with these axonemes sticking out. And at least the ones present today, if we cut across them, see in cross-section, these axonemes are made up of these double spiral arrays of microtubules, which I'll be talking about shortly. So this is in cross-section, and these are hollow tubes that go the length of the axoneme. And one of the things that got me interested in anesthesia early on in my career was that anesthetics cause these structures to depolymerize. If you put actinospherium in an anesthetic environment, the axonemes collapse. They depolymerize. And that was thought to be a mechanism of anesthesia, although it turns out that it requires quite a bit more anesthesia to depolymerize microtubules than it does to put someone to sleep. Nonetheless, it established a relationship. These same microtubules are found in nerve cells in our brains. So here's a neuron. This is the axon, where the microtubules are continuous and unipolar. And here are the dendrites, where the microtubules are interrupted and of mixed polarity in these local networks, which is where I think the consciousness occurs, in dendrites, in these unique networks of mixed polarity microtubules. And they're the same size as axons, the microtubules and axons. So we'll come back to microtubules in neurons a little bit. I think one thing that's true that everyone would agree, whether you're coming from an Eastern perspective or a Western perspective, is that consciousness is all that truly matters. From an Eastern perspective, that it's obvious. From a Western perspective, if you're brain dead or you're comatose, there's really no point in living. And this is a big problem in medicine to determine if people actually have consciousness when they're in a vegetative state or a comatose state. The question that everybody wonders about is whether consciousness can exist outside the body, after death, in reincarnation, for example. Is it possible that consciousness exists outside the body? We know many, many examples of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, anecdotal reports of afterlife, and so forth. We don't really know the answer to that. Western materialists would say, no, it's impossible. But they can't explain consciousness in the brain, so I don't see how they could exclude it from being outside the brain. Another question is, can consciousness be downloaded into a computer? There's a lot of talk now about downloading consciousness into a computer by decoding the brain, by figuring out, by mapping the brain, and something like this. And therefore, if you're wealthy enough and your body's about to die, you can download your consciousness into a computer. The big champion of this idea is, one of them is Ray Kurzweil, whose idea is called the Singularity. The idea there is that when our computers get equivalent to the brain in terms of computational complexity, that consciousness will be able to be downloaded into a computer, that consciousness can exist in a computer. I don't think so, but we'll come back to that. Now, one example of this is the film The Matrix, where consciousness existed in a virtual reality, Bing, perhaps, and also the film The Avatar, where consciousness was downloaded into this avatar who existed in this different world. The answers to these questions, whether consciousness can exist outside the body after life, and or whether it can be downloaded into a computer, depend on what consciousness actually is. So the question then becomes, how does the brain produce consciousness? We know the brain has consciousness. How does it do that? That's a good question. It's something that I've been spending my career working on, and many of the people in this room have, and many people around the world have. We take it for granted that when we open our eyes, the world out there appears in our head. something like that. How that happens is studied by neuroscientists who probe the brain, by roboticists, computer scientists, by artists who try to capture the essence of awareness, physicists studying reality, psychiatrists looking into the deeper levels of the brain, anesthesiologists, and that looks suspiciously like me, meditators and Eastern spiritualists, and Western philosophers. So in Western philosophy, the brain is thought to produce consciousness by complex computation among neurons. So the light enters Plato's head, if this is Plato, bing, and he has the world in his head. The world out there is all in our head, according to Western philosophy. But this causes some problems. As Plato noted, for example, this representation may poorly represent reality. For example, in Plato's cave, where his impression was that only two-dimensional shadows existed. There were only two dimensions in reality, and that was enough. That's all he knew, or they knew. Perhaps there's a deeper reality, more exciting, more interesting, deeper. And a lot of people today think that that's the case. Descartes picked up on this idea and noticed that it was true that we could each be a mere brain in a vat, fed information by an evil genius. So here's a brain in a vat. Computer in this case is feeding information, and he's thinking, bing, I'm walking outside in the sun. And this is the Matrix and other films have picked up on this idea. So both, according to Western philosophy, both consciousness and reality may be illusion. So modern Western science sees the brain as a computer in which nerve cells, neurons, shown here, and synapses act like bits and switches in a computer. So this is the basic metaphor, analogy, between the brain and computers. And the idea that each neuron, firing on each neuron is one bit, one single bit of information. And I think there's big problems with that, but that is the paradigm. We'll come back to that. Descartes made other contributions. He said that the contents of consciousness are like a play on a stage. So we have inputs, script, story, props, actors, lighting, and so forth onto a stage, which is then presented to the audience. So the problem is, who's the audience? For Descartes, it was the soul floating above the body. He was a dualist. Now, in the 70s, computer scientists, Simon and Newell and many others, developed similar computer architectures based on this, where you had various inputs into a global workspace or a CPU that then presented outputs which went to a monitor, so you could look at it on a computer screen. In the 80s, neuroscientists, including Bernie Bars, Edelman, Tononi, Shanzhou, Dehaene, Crick and Kolk, and others, cast thalamocortical oscillations as this Cartesian theater, if you will, with sensory inputs, memory, and so forth, coming down from executive cortex into this thalamocortical system, which then somehow produced consciousness, bing, based on sensory stimuli and arousal, bottom up and top down. And that was the dominant paradigm for a number of years. Thalamocortical projections mediate arousal and sensory-based consciousness. So this is the thalamocortical system, and you can see coming up from below, it spreads out to all different parts of the cortex. But what about mental states without sensory inputs and arousals? What about if you close your eyes and daydream? Perhaps some of you are doing that right now, and thinking about something else. These are task-free, stimulus-independent thought, internally generated states, mind-wandering, episodic memory, meditation, daydreaming. They may not depend on sensory inputs. How does that work? Marcus Raichle described these types of processes as default modes, or the brain's dark energy, and showed that they included a number of things like episodic memory, introspection, self-referential thought, daydreaming, etc., creativity, meditation, that occurred without sensory inputs. They could be cued or triggered by sensory inputs, but they can occur without them. And he showed in this excellent paper in 2005 in PNAS that if you look at these areas here, that over time they flip from being very active to very inactive, and other areas do the opposite. So it seems that either the sensory-based inputs system or the default mode system are active at any one time, and that the brain switches back and forth between these two states. So there's attention-based sensory processing, the thalamocortical system, and there's the default mode networks, mind-wandering episodic memory, internally generated states. And consciousness seems to go back and forth between these two states roughly every 10 seconds. Now, they can vary highly, but if you look at it over a longer time scale, it's about every 10 seconds. And these were the anti-correlated networks of Reichl. Now, the sensory-driven and default mode networks don't really tell us about consciousness, however, because both of them, or either of them, can either be non-conscious, what David Chalmers calls the easy problems, zombie modes, the autopilot. For example, all these sensory perception, control behavior, learning, memory, attention, language, etc., can be at sometimes conscious or non-conscious, as here, and other times conscious, again, shown in pink. So over time, what happens is that things move back and forth, and we go different processes becoming conscious and non-conscious. Consciousness moves around the brain as a kind of self-organizing process. It's not that there's one area of the brain that's directing, okay, now you're conscious, now you're conscious. It's more of an envelope or a self-organizing process moving around. That's what we need to figure out. What distinguishes conscious from non-conscious brain processes? We go back to the basic metaphor in Western science that neurons and synapses are like nodes and switches in a computer. And we find what's called the Hodgkin-Huxley neuron. This is the basic concept of a neuron that stems from the 50s and Huxley, where you have a cell body and many dendrites that receive information and integrate that information to a threshold at the axon hillock or axon initiation zone and triggers an all or none spike. So this is kind of like analog and this is digital. And the signals in the Western paradigm are by ion channels at the membrane. So this is considered to all be membrane-based processing. And I think that's a mistake. But the idea is the Hodgkin-Huxley neuron integrates inputs and triggers the outputs to the next layer of neurons. Integrate and fire. Integrate and fire. That's the basic idea in Western neuroscience. So here's a biological neuron with the dendrites and cell body integrating, triggering at the axon initiation segment, firing to the next. This is a computer model that was taken by a number of people in computer science to make computer systems, neural networks, based on integrated fire neural networks, which integrate and then fire. And this is kind of a cartoon version of both of them. So if we have a network of these neurons where firing is, I've got the dendrites and the axon together here, although that's not necessarily true. Inputs coming in over here from the left, and outputs over there in the top and bottom. And depending on the inputs, you can see a 0, 1 to make it simple, that over time we get various outputs dependent on inputs. So given set of inputs will give a given set of outputs. And that's pretty much the paradigm in modern science. But where's consciousness? Now, people in this view would say, well, consciousness emerges at a high level of complexity of this type of computation. But nobody's ever specified a threshold or said why that should happen or how it happens or how many neurons or how many firings or how complex and so forth. So it doesn't really explain it. Where's the Bing is another way of putting it. And also, where's the synchrony? One thing we do know is that, so let me just back up and say the brain as a neuronal computer cannot account for consciousness, I would argue, at least it hasn't as yet, and cannot account for gamma synchrony, which correlates with consciousness. Now, as you probably know, the best neural correlate of consciousness, the NCC, is gamma synchrony EEG. So if you put electrodes on someone's brain, you get all these squiggly lines, and then you do a Fourier analysis, and you break it into, or you break it down into different frequency bins, the so-called EEG bands, and gamma, which is 30 to 90 hertz, is the one that seems to correlate best with consciousness. And coherence in gamma synchrony across brain regions is the best correlate of consciousness. But, for example, on a visual cue, a few 100 milliseconds afterwards, there's a burst of gamma synchrony with other cortical regions, and this is what correlates with consciousness. So this part of the brain and these other parts of the brain are synchronized in the range of 30 to 90 hertz, and that's gamma synchrony. And that's the best measurable correlate of consciousness that we have. In this study that was done from Davidson's lab at Wisconsin, with Lutz as the lead author in PNAS about probably 8 or 10 years ago, they looked for gamma synchrony in meditating monks who were selected by the Dalai Lama for their long history and proficiency in meditating. And the control group was college students who were taught to meditate over a couple days. Now, the college students had gamma synchrony, but the monks had gamma synchrony that was higher in terms of frequency. It was actually roughly 80 hertz, whereas the average is 40 hertz, and also higher intensity. So higher intensity, more highly coherent, and higher frequency in the trained meditative monks. And I would argue that they are more conscious than these guys. Now, how do you explain gamma synchrony? This is somewhat of a controversial area, because if you have axonal dendritic connections in chemical synapses, you get delays, and it's very difficult to have a perfect coherence. One factor that's involved is instead of dendritic axonal dendritic synapses, is side-to-side or lateral connections through what are called gap junctions, where the gap junctions can be open or closed, and when they are open, this dendrite and these dendrites and these dendrites are synchronized and will depolarize synchronously, coherently. So here's some schematics of a neuron where we have the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon here. We can see the internal structure of the microtubules, which we'll get to in a moment. And we can see that there are two types of synapses. There's the chemical synapses that everybody talks about, where a chemical is released and goes across to the postsynaptic receptors. There's also, in this case, dendritic gap junctions, where the membranes are fused and will synchronize and will depolarize synchronously. So if this one depolarizes, this one will also. And here we see a gap junction. It's actually a window or a door. It'd be as if we opened the door to that other room and we all became part of one room, and we're all synchronized together. So it creates sort of a syncytium among neurons. So if you connect neurons by these lateral dendritic gap junctions, you get synchrony. So, and this we know from studies measuring consciousness, correlating with consciousness, that this type of dendritic gap junction mediated synchrony correlates with consciousness, with Bing. So if we have our network of neurons and we open a gap junction here and we see coherence, and depending on which ones open and which ones don't, we see this envelope of synchronized neurons that actually can move around the brain. And I would argue that consciousness exists in this type of dendritic gap junction mediated neurons that literally move around the brain, can go wherever consciousness wants to go. So if you're watching me and listening to me, it's maybe in your occipital and auditory cortex, and then you daydream about something, it goes somewhere else. For example, the evidence for this is that gap junction mediated gamma synchrony in olfactory bulb cortex correlates with conscious smell. So if you smell something, there is gap junction mediated gamma synchrony in your olfactory cortex. Conscious feelings of pleasure and reward correlate with gap junction mediated gamma synchrony in dopaminergic nucleus accumbens. So here's the Bing here. So if you have gamma synchrony between the prefrontal cortex, nucleus accumbens, and ventral tegmentum, you're having pleasurable feelings. And that correlates with gap junction mediated synchrony in these areas. So to summarize these ideas, I published a paper called The Conscious Pilot, which is based on the idea that dendritic synchrony moves through the brain to mediate consciousness. And I used a metaphor of an airplane on autopilot. And we can do a lot of things on autopilot without consciousness. But if there's turbulence or the plane's in trouble, the pilot better get back in the cockpit and take over. So consciousness can literally move around, leave the cockpit, go to the bathroom or whatever, and then come back. And I think sometimes you're driving your car, well, maybe not in India. You have to be pretty conscious in India of what's going on. But where I live, you can sort of daydream while you're driving. My colleague Mark Ebner and I published a computer model of this on laterally connected artificial neurons in a network, and showed that we could detect figure-to-ground changes. So, brain as neuronal computer cannot account for gamma synchrony, which correlates with consciousness. Also, the next topic is brain activity comes too late for real-time control, according to this view, renders consciousness epiphenomenal illusion. That is, it occurs too late, it's after the fact, and we don't really have any free will or anything like free will. We're just kind of along for the ride. The evidence for this goes back a long ways. Brain activity correlating with conscious perception apparently occurs too late, 150 to 500 milliseconds after impingement on our sense organs, to account for actions initiated or completed within 100 milliseconds. So let's say you're talking to somebody and you hear what they say and you respond to them. You think you're responding consciously, but if you look in your brain, the activity that correlates with figuring out what they said happens after you've already responded. So this includes preparation of spoken words, analysis of sensory input, choice playing a voluntary action, hitting a baseball or a cricket ball pitched at 90 miles an hour. The processing just seems to be too late, but yet we've already responded. So the presumption is we respond non-consciously and have a false illusion of being in conscious control. Because subjectively, we feel as though we perceive and respond to these perceptions consciously. Consequently, subjective feeling of conscious control of these behaviors is illusion. They are merely non-conscious reflexive responses. Wegner, Dennett, and so forth. This is pretty much the party line in neuroscience, that we are acting non-consciously much of the time, and consciousness is epiphenomenal. It occurs too late. Accordingly, consciousness is epiphenomenal, and we are, as T.H. Huxley famously said, conscious automata, helpless spectators. And I use the Pac-Man here, who's being manipulated through this grid by somebody pushing a lever. Except in this case, it would be your subconscious or non-conscious activity moving you around. Is there any hope for free will? I believe there is. I'll get to the solution in a minute. But one example of why it looks bad, it looks like we can't have conscious control in real time, comes from evidence from Ben Libet's readiness potential, which I think has been misinterpreted. But basically, the experiment was you ask someone to lift their finger, and you record when they lift their finger, and you ask them when they decided to lift their finger, and you measure their brain activity. And what they found was that the readiness potential, that there's activity well before the person says, I decided to move it now, and even before they actually move their finger. So this was interpreted to mean that this activity here is initiating the finger movement, and this conscious intent, I decide to move my finger, happens after the decision has been made by your non-conscious brain. We'll come back to that in a second. Another example of this is the color 5 phenomenon. So over here we have a red ball and a green ball. Or actually, we have one ball. So the observer is looking this way. Here's the screen, and this is time. So the red starts on the left, goes away, and appears on the right a few milliseconds later. Red, green. Now, if you look at it, you see red turning to green halfway across, which makes sense. But if you then trick the person, after doing this maybe 100 times, you then go red, they're not fooled. You'd think they would be fooled because they're used to seeing that, but they're not. The observer seems to know what the final color will be. How does that happen? Now, Dan Dennett, who believes in epiphenomenalism, says that the brain alters and fills in content. Real-time perception is overwritten and remembered. So time is here in the red-green, and what he says is that it doesn't matter what happens in real time. What happens is what is remembered and put into memory storage. So there's a delay, and then you know, oh, it's green, or it's red. In this case, it's green. And that's what you remember. And implying our remembered consciousness occurs epiphenomenally after the fact. We are literally living in the past. And real-time conscious experience is an illusion. Is there any hope for free will? We'll come back to the color 5 phenomenon. Now, Libet also did sensory experiments, which I think were much more interesting than his finger-moving experiments. He had patients under having neurosurgery while awake. Their brains were exposed. And we still do this occasionally, but generally they're asleep now. But he could talk to them, and he recorded and could stimulate the part of their brain for their, let's say, their finger here. He could also stimulate the finger. Now, if he stimulated the finger and recorded here for 500 milliseconds, he got what's called an evoked potential almost right away. This is well known. And ongoing brain activity. If you stimulated here the brain, and the conscious experience, if you stimulate the finger, occurs right away, immediately, almost immediately, allowing for transition to the brain within roughly 90 milliseconds. However, if you stimulate the brain directly and there's ongoing activity, you don't get the conscious experience for about 500 milliseconds, for about a half a second. And this is Libet's famous half a second, 500 milliseconds. So the point is that both, now, what he then did was he tricked them and stimulated the thalamus and so forth, where he got an evoked potential, but then there would be no further brain activity. So the point is that you need both the evoked potential and the ongoing activity out to 500 milliseconds to have conscious experience back here. So the brain or the person or someone must know somehow that this activity is going to continue for 500 milliseconds. Libet concluded that the subjective experience was referred backward in time, from the time of the neuronal adequacy, as he called it, back to the evoked potential. Consciousness is referred backward in time. Now, he published this and was ridiculed by Dennett and Pat Churchland and many philosophers. This is obviously impossible, he must be crazy, and they kind of badgered him, and he kind of backed off and changed his tune. But I think he was right. I think that consciousness can be referred backwards in time. Now, this sounds crazy, but it's known to occur at some times. So, for example, Wheeler and Feynman said that classical electromagnetics allow backward time referral, but requires quantum system, a coherent absorber. Yakir Aharonov, who works with Minos Kafatos, who is here, has described the dual vector theory. Each quantum state reduction sends quantum information both forward and backward in time. And Ben Schumacher and then Roger Penrose said that non-local quantum entanglement, which is a well-known phenomenon, involves referral of quantum information backwards in time. Now, entanglement, this is the EPR, Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, where you have two quantum particles that are paired, and they're in superposition of both up and down, spin, for example. And you send one along a wire to Rajasthan, another along a wire to Delhi, and you make the measurement in Rajasthan, and if it's down, then the partner in Delhi is up. And if this one's up, this one's down. There's instantaneous communication across many great distance. I think the current record is hundreds of kilometers. The explanation that Penrose and Schumacher and others put that when you make the measurement, the quantum information, which is a strange bird, quantum information, goes backwards in time to when they were together and then out the forward limb. And the communication, signaling, you can't really call it communication, involves backward time effects. There's evidence for this, too, backward time effects. Libet's backward time referral. Daryl Bem, Dick Bierman, Dean Radin have all done pre-sentiment experiments, or Bem called it feeling the future, where someone looks at a signal and seems to know in advance that it's what it's going to be. Zeilinger has shown choice of the measurement mode determines the wave-particle behavior. You can make the choice of measurement after the behavior has occurred, as long as it isn't observed in the meantime. You can have an effect backwards in time. And in neuroscience, I've noticed at least 3 labs that I'm aware of, mainstream neuroscience labs, doing mainstream types of experiments, have found responses of neurons in the brain before the stimulus occurs. But they cover it up. They won't talk about it. And it's embarrassing. And I've had someone say to me, well, if I talk, it'll ruin my career. Nobody will believe me. I'll say, you're sitting on one of the great discoveries of all time. You know, show a little courage. But so far they haven't. But we're working on it. So how would this explain some of the problems about epiphenomenalism? Well, if you have, going back to the color phi effect, instead of this happening afterwards, if you have backward referral, the observation can be in real time. So the observer knows that it's going to be green or red because the information is going backwards in time. Now, in Libet readiness potential, the non-conscious choice could be informed by backward time referral of quantum information So you actually make the decision at this point that you're going to move your finger, and it's sent backwards in time, and so it's consistent with the results. And I described all this in a paper in Frontiers in Integrative Neuroscience last year, how quantum brain biology can rescue conscious free will, because you need quantum effects in the brain to have this backward time effect. Now this would require some effect on neuronal behavior other than inputs, membrane potentials, and so forth, some deviation from Hodgkin-Huxley behavior, and there's evidence for that. For example, in this paper in Nature in 2006, this is the prediction from Hodgkin-Huxley. This is the membrane potential in the dendrites and soma, and the axon spiking, which is kind of gradual and fairly tight. So there's a very narrow threshold, as you would predict. But with the actual, if you look at neurons in an awake animal, you see a very broad threshold, high variability in temporal, and that the threshold for firing in a given neuron fluctuates from spike to spike. So there's some other factor initiating threshold and spiking other than simply membrane inputs. Also, the verticality of this was surprising, which seems to indicate that all the ion channels in the axon hillock were opening simultaneously, that they might be coherently coupled or entangled. So, for example, in integrated fire, the variability, the temporal variability and the wide threshold could be caused by backward time referral and or some other effects from internal cytoskeleton or other neurons. One other deviation from Hodgkin-Huxley that's kind of hushed up and covered up was reported by Christoph Koch's group, where they measured from the same apical cortical neuron at the brain surface and in the cell body, and they found that the membrane potential, the so-called noise, was perfectly correlated from the microns away. And this can't be explained by membrane potentials, and it can't really be explained by electromagnetic effects. They didn't really have a good explanation for it. So this isopotentiality, that there can be this constant coherence among different parts of a neuron. So that was brain activity comes too late. Another problem for mainstream approaches is quantum cognition. This is a very exciting new area that we're going to hear about from Peter Bruzza later in the week here, that mental activities fit quantum mathematics more closely than classical Bayesian mathematics. Now, what does that mean? For example, just descriptively, conflict, ambiguity, uncertainty are best viewed as quantum superposition of multiple possible judgments and beliefs. Measurement, for example, answering a question. You're not really sure, someone asks you a question, I better decide, you come up with an answer. Or reaching a decision, you just finally decide something, reduces possibilities to definite states. You're constructing reality, you're collapsing the wave function. This is more of a quantum paradigm. Previous questions influence subsequent answers, so sequence affects outcomes. This is contextual non-commutativity, which is a principle of quantum mathematics and not classical mathematics. And judgments and choices may deviate from classical logic, suggesting random or non-computable quantum influences. Something else is influencing the choices. Now, Pados and Busemeyer have a target article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences called Can Quantum Probability Provide a New Direction for Cognitive Modeling? And in that paper, they showed this graph where these are projections in abstract Hilbert space of mental representations. So for t equals 25 milliseconds and gamma synchrony, E is about 10 to the 10th tubulins, and there's about 10 to the 9th tubulins per neuron, but not all the tubulins in a neuron would necessarily be involved, so this could be anywhere from, we've estimated 20,000 to 1 million neurons for each conscious moment. In our recent paper, Roger and I are working on now, he put forth the idea that I really like, that the 40 hertz could be beat frequencies of slightly different, faster microtubule oscillations. For example, the megahertz oscillations in microtubules that Anirban Bandyapade has discovered, and I think we'll talk about later in the week. So, and he'll also tell us, I hope, about resonances in microtubules at different frequencies. And if you have resonances and beat frequencies, it's kind of musical. And it could be that consciousness is kind of the music of the universe, and that there's resonances and beat frequencies occurring in the very fine structure of the universe itself. So this is a video. Hopefully it'll play. It's very short. Okay. Is there sound?
The principal way brain cells communicate with each other is by exchanging chemicals. That's the large-scale view which all biologists understand. But in the neurons is a denser jungle of tiny structures called microtubules. Constantly flickering when you're conscious, they stop functioning under anesthetic. Hameroff concluded these microtubules must be an essential element in what creates consciousness. They create a secluded environment where quantum events could occur. He believes it's due to these quantum events that consciousness occurs at all.
I always think it sounds better with a British accent. So with Travis Craddock and Jack Jasinski, we've gone a little bit deeper into this more recently and also tried to adapt to the quantum cognition paradigm, which I think is going to be a real change. If you look at what tubulin actually looks like, instead of these peanut-shaped cartoons, this is what it looks like. And this is the work. This is a simulation done by Travis, looking at the aromatic amino acids in tubulin, and why that's important. I'll come to in a second. But anesthetic gases, which is what my primary interest of study is, how anesthetics take away consciousness. They work only by quantum interactions, and they bind in nonpolar hydrophobic regions, either in membrane proteins or, I think, in tubulin, by very weak van der Waals London forces that are called dipole dispersion forces. So in this figure, Travis modeled the location of tryptophan in the blue, phenylalanine in purple, tyrosine here, and these are neurotransmitters, which we don't have. But just to show you how structurally similar psychedelic drugs are and psychoactive neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. They're pretty much the same structure. So if you look at where they are in a microtubule, in a tubulin, one tubulin, so this is one tubulin in a microtubule, they sort of line up in channels, and the red are where anesthetics bind. Travis simulated binding of anesthetics, and they're very close to these aromatic amino acids. Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, if you think about where does consciousness occur in the body, it's the same question, I think, as where do anesthetics act? Because anesthesia is fairly selective. I put a patient to sleep, and he or she continues to breathe. Their brain is still active. We do evoke potentials where we're stimulating them. For example, for spine surgery, we want them to be able to process information from we're stimulating the foot and recording in the brain to make sure their spine is okay, but yet they're unconscious. So the brain is processing signals even without consciousness. But anesthesia selectively takes away consciousness while sparing non-conscious brain activities. And how does it do that? Well, it binds in it was shown at the turn of the 20th century that anesthetics bind in a particular lipid-like or olive oil-like environment. They bind in something that resembles olive oil or benzene. And this is also aromatic amino acids. So this diagram is a phase diagram, solubility diagram of a body. It's as if you took a human and ground them up and just looked at what their solubility compartments are. And going in this direction, this is polarity. So this is water soluble, for example, soluble in blood and water. Whereas you go this way, it's nonpolar. And so this would be fat and membranes and nonpolar regions within proteins, and including the aromatic rings, phenylalanine, tyrosine, tryptophan, right here. There's benzene right there. And this right here is where anesthetics act. And that's the only place they go. And they selectively erase consciousness, which says to me that this is where consciousness is occurring, in this phase here. Now this is, but not in a ground-up former person, but in a person in whom these things are still viable. Namely, in the aromatic rings here, that Travis showed. And they act by what are called London forces. So if you take, say, two benzenes, and depending on whether you use valence theory or a molecular orbital theory, in valence theory they oscillate back and forth. In molecular orbital theory you have a superposition of both. So you have three extra electron bonds, and they can be distributed or they can oscillate back and forth. Now, one of our critics said that our theory is impossible because the London forces would be like this. You can't have switching back and forth. And that's true if there was only one aromatic ring. But actually, there's two or more. It takes two to tango, if you will. And when you have two or more London forces, the dipoles, these quantum dipoles, oscillate back and forth, shown here in two different types of artistic representation, and can be in superposition of both. So going back to what Travis showed, we think we see channels along certain axes in the tubulin, which then line up with axes in a microtubule. And this is where the anesthetics bind. And we think that these are forming giant dipoles, very much like Froelich described in the 70s. Giant dipoles where there's collective activity. Because here you have the aromatic rings, and so here they're all lined up going this way, upward more or less, or rightward at least. In the blue they're going downward, and in the gray they can be in superposition of both. Now if you add an anesthetic, the anesthetic, which by dipole dispersion forces, messes up the collective dipoles. You don't have these collective dipoles, and you don't have superposition. You have kind of haphazard arrangements of the dipoles. You've dispersed the dipoles. And that is how anesthesia works, I would say. It's messing up, it's dispersing the dipoles that are required for consciousness, both in these dipoles and in the superposition. Now, how does this relate? This is actually very similar to what's found in photosynthesis. When we first started this work, 20 years ago, people said, "You're crazy. Everybody knows that quantum coherence can't happen in biology. It's too warm. If you want to build a quantum computer, you have to go to the laboratory and do it at absolute zero because decoherence, any vibration, will mess up the quantum coherence." And we said, well, it seems that biology's had billions and billions of years to figure it out. It probably figured it out. In the last 6 or 7 years, quantum biology has been found in warm systems, in many systems, in bird brains, in smell and olfaction, in DNA, and most notably in photosynthesis. So in photosynthesis, in plants, and we're on a farm basically here, and I think we're going to go to the fields later in the week, photons come into part of the FMN, it's called, the light harvesting complex, FMO. And to make food, it has to be, the energy has to be converted to electrons, taken to the reaction center to make glycogen or whatever it's going to make by electron transport. And you want this to be efficient because you want as much of the light energy to be converted to food. You don't want to waste it. And by the way, this is also applicable to people making solar cells. They're studying this very, very carefully. And what the Whaley-Fleming groups at UC Berkeley have figured out is that what happens is there are these chromophores, which are basically kind of like complexes of aromatic rings, just like I showed before, except they may have a metal with them, and that the electrons hop as electrons or excitons and occupy all the pathways, all the possible pathways at the same time to get from here to here. That's why it's so efficient. That's why food is relatively easy for plants to make because of this highly efficient electron transport, this exciton hopping. And we think the same thing can be happening in tubulin and microtubules. In other words, if a tomato can figure out how to use electron hopping, I think our brains probably could too. But we'll find out. So putting it together, what I think is happening is something like this. And this is applying what I just showed you to the quantum cognition ideas that I mentioned earlier. So here's a tubulin, and here I've just shown 3 aromatic rings. It's more complicated than that I showed you. And here the dipoles are pointing upward. And these correlate with the 3-starred helix around a microtubule. Microtubules have, at least the A lattice, have Fibonacci geometries. We have this is the 5-start helix going around, and this is the 8-start. And the dipole can be going upwards or downwards. Now, I'm calling this happy because the microtubule and the tubulin have a net dipole, positive and negative. Positive, 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 negative, negative, negative. And if the dipole is in the opposite direction to the dipole of the microtubule and the tubulin, it's going to be energetically favorable. It's going to be easier to fall into. It's going to be happy, if you will. If it has to fight the dipole and actually be additional dipole on top of it, it's going to be unhappy. So I'm just calling this happy and unhappy as a mental representation at the level of tubulins, but also relates to these pathways around the 3-start and over here the 8-start helix. And this is in a paper coming out in Topics in Cognitive Science in response to a lead article, several lead articles about quantum cognition. So this is the molecular correlate of quantum cognition, and this would be the superposition of the dipoles going in both states. So if you let these interact and go back to our OR model, they interact and there's a conscious moment, and the system has selected the yellow sunny disposition happy because it's energetically favorable, and you have a conscious moment bing with happiness associated with it. Now, obviously I'm sort of estimating here, but I think the energetic favorability and the fact that mental representations must occur somewhere, and I don't think it works very well at the neural level, and so I would argue that this is the origin of mental representation as dipole states in a microtubule. Similar was from another paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. This is my commentary to Potthos and Bussmeyer. And when I first heard about this quantum cognition stuff, I thought, this is an interesting wrinkle. But the more I read about it and the more stuff keeps coming out, I think it's going to be more than a wrinkle. I think it's going to be a revolution in cognitive science and neuroscience. Now, these pathways, helical pathways, seem to be equivalent to what are called topological qubits or braids in topological quantum computing. And also to what are called quantum walks in a Feynman quantum chessboard. Fuss and Navarro wrote a paper about cognitive dipoles as quantum walks, and they had this diagram which is a Feynman path integral in a lattice, which is called a Feynman chessboard. And so you could take the blue or you could take the yellow and have a superposition of both, and a collapse will occur and you'll pick one particular path. So it could be yellow happy or blue unhappy. Here's pretty much the same thing in a microtubule lattice. You can see it's a skewed hexagon, and I think the same thing could be happening in a microtubule lattice. So these topological dipoles can be equivalent to quantum walks or also to topological qubits. So you might say, okay, well that's great. Well, how would that be read out? Because after all, you're going to move your hand or you've got to decide to do something. So how would the microtubule activities be amplified even further? Well, microtubules can be involved in integration inside dendrites and soma to modulate axonal firing. They can rearrange microtubule map scaffoldings in neuronal growth and synaptic plasticity, motor protein routing, memory, and consciousness. If you have a moment of consciousness, that's the readout right there. Aha, I thought of something. I feel something. It doesn't necessarily have to have some behavior, although it certainly could. Another possibility is that it's involved in some kind of fractal like brain processes, and I'm going to briefly go over this because this has been talked about before, but there's a lot of evidence for fractal 1 over f scale invariant processes in the brain and EEG patterns, in fractal eye movements, in small world networks like airport hubs, speculation on holographic brain, in grid cells, in the entorhinal cortex, and so forth. All of these seem to have some kind of fractal-like processes, and so these processes, the microtubules, might scale up for behavioral processing in that way. And speaking of scaling up, by equals h over t here, depending on the frequency domain and the different frequencies, here's Pokorny and Anirban Bandyapaty's roughly 10 megahertz or less. Also Jack at 10 kilohertz, and Freeman and Rakeley is slower and so forth. And the speculation of higher, that this can happen at multiple scales, and that consciousness can occur as sort of a fractal at different time and spatial domains in the brain. And when you get faster and small enough, you're actually purely in space-time geometry, and you more or less don't need the brain anymore. And I always like this, the quote from the Beatles: the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the deeper you go. So as you go faster and faster and more deeply into the universe, into the fine-scale structure of the universe, involving more and more, you have a more intense experience. And if we go back to the idea of space-time geometry, that consciousness is actually happening in space-time geometry, as you go deeper at higher frequencies, you go deeper into the fine-scale structure of the universe and have more intense experience. And I think that meditative states and maybe even altered states and things that are talked about in Eastern philosophy, astral planes and so forth, might actually involve consciousness existing in space-time geometry without biology. So if we go back, to wrap up, if we go back to when did consciousness arise, and look at the evolution. Now, for cognitive consciousness, I've suggested in an article 15 years ago or so that consciousness actually arose in these creatures at the Cambrian evolutionary explosion, which is what caused the accelerated evolution. Because an organism that has consciousness will have an advantage over those that don't in terms of survival. And just in terms of survival. And if you look at this one, we know that it's actinospherium, and they're made of microtubules. So perhaps the first cognitive consciousness that is organized, behaviorally oriented, occurred in these types of organisms. And it's similar because there's about 10. We know that there's about 10 to the 9th tubulins, and by E equals h over t, reduction could occur in a fairly brief period of time, like less than a minute. Smaller organisms would take too long, and before that happens, they get eaten by something else. So I think the onset of the Cambrian evolutionary explosion correlated with fairly rapid conscious moments, and Bing may have happened in these types of organisms initially. Finally, I want to close by saying that I showed you the Big Bang earlier, and Vahid Gurdjian and Roger Penrose have a theory that we're going to hear about later in the week called cyclical conformal cosmology, that the Big Bang, let's say here, was preceded by a Big Bang, which in the universe, preceded by another and another and another. And if that's the case, then there's no reason to suspect that we didn't have consciousness in these previous universes, and that Bing and consciousness has been around for a long time, even before the Big Bang and going back previous universes. Of course, we don't know. But if there were previous universes, perhaps subsequent ones are evolving and mutating to get better and better for life and consciousness. That's a possibility. So let me conclude with 4 points. That first, consciousness or its precursors have been in the universe all along. Biology evolved orchestration mechanisms for cognitive consciousness. 2, consciousness is a self-organizing process in the fine structure of reality. You might think of it as the music of the universe, self-organizing processes in the very fabric of reality. That consciousness, independent of biology and the fine-scale structure of reality, is plausible. Again, people who say, afterlife and out-of-body experiences and all this is impossible, when they can't explain normal consciousness in the brain. And until they do so, they can't rule out consciousness out of the brain. And finally, I think medical therapies for neurological and mental disorders should be aimed at microtubules. Thank you very much.